Hi, 7th graders. We are on lesson 5-2, which starts on page 256 in your textbook. Converting between fractions, decimals, and percents, and comparing rational numbers. So we know, because we've talked about percents in lesson 5-1, that a percent means that it's that number out of 100. So 20% means 20 out of 100, 90% means 90 out of 100. It's always out of 100. So if we want to change a percent to a decimal, we want to move the decimal point 2 places to the left. So if you think about it, if we have 50%, we know that 50% is half. We just know that off the top of our head. And we also know that half is the same as 0.5 or 0.50. So if I have a decimal point, because if we just take 50, even though we don't have a decimal point showing, we always know that there is a decimal point, an invisible one, after a whole number. So if I have it right after my 0 and I go over 2, then that gives me 0.50. Which makes sense because we know that 50% is the same as half, which is 0.5 or 0.50. So 100%, since everything is out of 100, 100%, if we take our decimal and we move it over 2, then 100% is the same as 1.00 or just 1. So 100% is one whole. So everything under 100%, when we change it to a decimal, it should be less than 1. So if we have 35%, so again, if we want to change a percent to a decimal, we move the decimal point 2 places to the left. This is probably something that you want to include in your notes. Changing a percent to a decimal and reminding yourself that a percent equals out of 100. So 35%, our decimal is, if there's not a decimal shown, our decimal, it always starts right after the number. So 35%, our decimal starts here. We go 2 to the left. So our decimal then, we would write it as 0.35. 35% is less than 50%, so 0.35 is less than 0.5, which makes sense. 115%, so this is greater than 100, and if it's greater than 100, then it's going to be greater than 1, our decimal is. So we always start after the last number if there's no decimal, so after the ones place, and we go over 2. We only go over 2. So our decimal for 115% is going to be 1.15. 5%, we always start again after the ones place, so we start after the 5. We go over 2. We always go over 2 even if there's not a number there. If there's not a number there, then we add a 0. So our decimal for 5% is going to be 0.05. This is the biggest mistake that I see, is that people forget to add their 0. So make sure you add a 0. And then 0.2%. Well, our decimal is already right here. So this time we don't start after the 2. We start right where the decimal is, and now we still move it over 2. And just like we did before, we have to add our 0. So our decimal for 0.2% is going to be 0.002. All right, if we want to change a decimal to a percent, we move the decimal point 2 places to the right. So I would write this down as well. Oops. Percent to decimal, we're moving 2 places to the left. You might want to have some examples down. Decimal to percent, we're moving the decimal point 2 places to the right. And then we make it a percent. So here, our decimal is right after our 0, so 0.2. We're going to move it over 2. Remember, we always go 2 even if there's not a 0. And our answer then is 20, and then we need to make it a percent. So 20%. And to check, to go backwards, if we start our decimal here and we go back 2, it would be 0.2. So that makes sense. Okay, so for this one, over 2, so then our percent would be 166%. Here we would have 83%. And then this time we take our decimal and we go over 2. So I can cancel off my zeros above or before my first 0, and I can just write it as 0.5. But just because it has a decimal doesn't mean it can't be a percent. It's still 0.5%. So you need to make sure you remember, this one we're going over too. You need to remember if you're writing it as a percent, it needs to have the percent sign behind it. If you're writing it as a decimal, it needs to have the decimal in front of it or the decimal wherever it goes. Okay, if we want to change fractions to percents, we already did in lesson 5.1 changing fractions to percents by changing the denominator so that it is 100, but that is not always the case. Sometimes we can't get it to be an even 100. So what we could do, and you could write this down if you want in your notes really quick, to change fractions to percents, we're going to divide the numerator by the denominator and then move the decimal 2 places to the right. So there's a couple different ways to do it. I just want to show you. If we want to write 3/8 as a percent, well, we know that 3/8 is going to be something over 100, which that something would be the percent that we figure out. Because remember, our percents are always over 100. So if I write it as 3/8, well, we know that 8 times something is going to equal 100. So then 3 times something is going to equal our x. So we can solve this as a proportion. 3 times 100 equals 8 times x, and then we solve it, and we get x equals 37.5. So our answer then would be 37.5%. Because since we were finding x and it was already out of 100, then we don't move the decimal at all. We just leave it because we had already figured it out over 100. The other way that we can do it is we can simply just take 3 and divide it by 8. Not 8 divided by 3, but you would do 3 and you would divide it by 8, and you would come up with 0.375. So that's our decimal, 0.375. Then we move it over 2 to the right, and we get 37.5%. Okay, so let's do another one, and we'll do it with using method 2. So for 2/3, if I take 2 and I divide it by 3, and a lot of us know that 2/3 equals 0.666666. So I would end up with, so we'll just write it like this. 2/3 equals 0.6666, and going on and on and on and on forever. Okay, so remember to change a decimal to a percent. We take our decimal and we move it over 2. So it would go right in between our second and third 6. So then we would write it, and we could write it as 66.6%, and we would have our repeating sign over our 6, or our 6/10. Okay, 7/25. We could do this one a couple different ways. We know that 25 times 4 equals 100, and 7 times 4, or we do the same to our numerator and denominator, so then we are left with 28 hundredths. And we know that 28 hundredths equals 28% because it is already out of 100. So any number out of 100, you just write it as a percent. And that's it. You just take the number and you write it as a percent, if only if it is over 100. 7 25ths, we can also do 7 divided by 25, and we would get 0.28. And then we know that 0.28, if we move our decimal over 2 to the right, then we would get 28%. Okay, last problem that we have, if we want to order these from least to greatest, we have 22%, 1/10, 3/25, and 0.25. What I would do is get them all into percents, and then we can figure out which is the least and which is the greatest. So we already have 22%. 1/10, we can do 1 divided by 10. And if you do 1 divided by 10, you should get 0.1, or we know that 1/10 is the same as 1/10, 0.1. So then I would take my decimal and I would go over 2. Remember, if there's not anything there, then we add a 0. If there's not anything there when you go to the right or go to the left, you will add a 0. So now our new decimal is over here. And so 1/10 is the same as 10%. Okay, 3/25 is we can take 3 and divide it by 25, and we would get 0.12. We also know that 25 times 4 is 100, so 3 times 4 is 12, so we would get 12 over 100, which would be 12%, and 0.12 is the same as 12%. Okay, and then we have 0.25. We can move this over 2, and we have 25%. So now if we want to write it in order from least to greatest, we know that 10% is the least, and then 12%, and then 22%, and then 25%. So we are going to rewrite it in the original form that it is given to us. So we would write it then as 1/10, and then 3/25, and then 22%, and then 0.25. All right, so if you have any other questions, you can look in the book always for more examples and more information, or you can always look back and re-watch the video, and make sure that you go on to NICU and take the 5-2 NICU quiz.